Ambassador John Bolton was National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump in 2018 and 2019. He's author of the book, The Room Where It Happened. Ambassador, thanks for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
You've talked about this a little bit in public already, but I wanted to have you go into it at the start here. What was Donald Trump's overall attitude towards Ukraine? How would you characterize his general approach?
Well, I think he paid it very little attention up until the summer of 2019, when he realized that he could have the possibility of holding up the obligation and delivery of substantial security assistance in an effort to get access to the Hillary Clinton computer server that he felt was in Ukraine, finding out about Hunter Biden's income in Ukraine, and all of these things in this spaghetti bowl of conspiracy theories. That was the first time he really focused on it. But I can say that it was something that that made it hard for the rest of us who were concerned about the instability that we saw in Ukraine and Eastern Europe generally because of the Russian threat to get anything much done on it. And one small example of that is in the summer of 2018 at the famous NATO summit, where Trump came very close to announcing U.S. withdrawal. That meeting was entirely disrupted to deal with that issue when one of the subjects was going to be what to do about Ukraine. Then President Poroshenko of Ukraine was there. He barely had a chance to talk to Trump. And it was that kind of disruption that made it very hard to get any focused presidential level attention to the issue.
Now, I don't think we can underscore enough, but we're going to try to, how crazy some of this was in terms of Trump believing that Ukraine, for some reason, had the Democratic Party servers that had been hacked by Russia in 2016 during the election. I mean, this is Alex Jones level conspiracy nuttery, right? But to have policy driven by this notion that Ukraine somehow had the DNC servers, I mean, what did that look like to you? How upsetting was that?
Well, my experience in government, among other things, includes time in the George H.W. Bush administration when people recommended to Jim Baker, then in his capacity, not as Secretary of State anymore, but White House Chief of Staff, that in order to defeat Bill Clinton, we ought to try and get embassy files about Clinton's travels to Russia and so on. And Baker just said, we're not going to do that. We're just not going to do it. We're not going to ask other countries to find that kind of stuff. So that was the sort of bar that I had in my mind for what was permissible. But I must say I had any number of conversations with Trump, with Giuliani, with others about these theories that frankly I never could understand. I couldn't get to the bottom of them. They didn't connect with one another. They were based on some guy who told some other guy something that the president was determined to track down, mostly through Rudy, but through some others as well, to help his campaign. And you couldn't really discuss the subject of Ukraine or the threat posed by Russia or the status after the 2014 invasion without very quickly the conversation completely diverting to these other subjects.
Well, let's turn to Trump and Putin. In 2013, Trump tweeted out that he wanted Putin to become his new best friend. And then when he was in Moscow later that year for his Miss Universe contest, as Michael Isikoff and I reported in our book, Russian Roulette, he was desperate to get a meeting with Vladimir Putin. That's all he kept talking about. Will Putin see me? Meeting never happened. During the campaign, 2016 campaign, he said a lot of positive things about Putin. And of course, as president, he kept saying Putin's telling the truth when Putin denied his attack on the 2016 election. And then we all know, a couple of days ago, he was saying that Putin was a genius and smart and savvy for his moves against Ukraine. What gives? I mean, what do you make of Donald Trump's years-long infatuation with Putin? How do you explain that?
Well, I think it went along in a sense with his infatuation with Xi Jinping, with Recep Erdogan of Turkey, with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. He came very close to agreeing in the summer of 2019 to meet with the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran. He looked fondly on Maduro of Venezuela. I think I'm not a shrink, so I can't give you the clinical reason, but I think Trump thought of himself as a big guy, and he liked talking to other big guys, and they talked about big guy things that they did, and he kind of admired them.
I mean, you wrote in your book that you never had a serious conversation with Trump about Putin. To an outsider, over 2 years of the presidency, that seems completely absurd.
Yeah, well, that was the situation we faced flying to Helsinki for that famous summit. I thought that one of the things that Putin would almost certainly be pressing on were arms control matters. And we had tried to brief the president on that before the trip began, but unsuccessfully. So the briefing about what Putin might be saying and what our position should be took place on Air Force One while he was watching the FIFA World Cup event being broadcast on the TV. That was about the best we could do, really.
When you said you didn't succeed in getting a briefing, is that just because he wouldn't sit for it?
Yeah, there were other things to do. It just wasn't something he was interested in. It was reflected in a number of other contexts as well, because of his view that he didn't need to know these kinds of specifics, that he would size up the person on the other side of the table and they would establish a personal relationship. And from that would flow the policy decisions. And it was a great prize for Trump. He said it publicly any number of times. He said it privately as well, that U.S.-Russia relations were good because his relationship with Putin was good. And that's obviously not true, but that's what he felt.
Right. And did you ever feel compelled to try to have a conversation with him about Putin's attack on the U.S. election in 2016 and just make him come to terms with this?
Well, I did, and so did many other people. And you can't make Donald Trump come to terms with reality if he doesn't want to. But he was told it repeatedly. It just didn't fit with what he wanted to hear.
The other day, you said that it's your belief that if Trump had made it to a second term, he would have pulled out of NATO, which would have given Putin more or less the green light to do what we see him doing now, or something of the like. What makes you think that?
Well, Trump fundamentally didn't like the NATO alliance. He takes credit now for pushing the allies to meet their 2014 commitments of their 2014 agreement in Wales to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP for all NATO members. And he certainly did push on that issue, but and fully supported, I think, on a broad bipartisan basis in Congress and across the country. But he pushed it not to strengthen NATO, but because I think he fundamentally believed nobody would do it. And certainly at that time, the Germans were giving no indication they would come anywhere close to 2% in 2024. It took the invasion of Ukraine to get the Germans to do that. But I think from Trump's point of view, the world was kind of like a balance sheet on trade surplus good, trade deficit bad. We paid a lot of money that for the defense of Europe. We were getting screwed on defense on trade issues, and that's all he really cared about.
Yeah, so it was more transactional than ideological in terms of pulling out of NATO.
Right. I think, well, he was told by many of his advisors, Keith Kellogg, for example, that NATO was a waste of energy. I think he had acquired that belief somewhere before taking office, and I think he never really deviated much from it.
Let me shift over to China for a second. I thought one of the big headlines of your book was when you talked about or described a conversation, a meeting he had with President Xi Jinping of China, in which he essentially gave the Chinese president a green light to set up concentration camps for the Uyghurs. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, how did the rest of the National Security Council, the staff, other people in the foreign policy apparatus respond to that?
Well, the conversation where that took place was with Xi Jinping, I think, after a dinner at a G20 meeting, and we were told about it later. But it was something that made it really pretty effectively impossible to do anything about the situation for the Uyghurs. It was of a piece with Trump not wanting to even issue a statement from the White House on the Tiananmen Square's 30th, the anniversary of the 30th year since the massacre, and any number of other things, not saying much, if anything, about repression of religious freedom inside China. These were all things that were effectively put off limits.
And I'm just wondering, what it's like to be within this Trump land, to sort of see him, not talking about Putin and giving green lights to concentration camps. I mean, people did not resign in mass over this, but what did it feel like or mean to the people living with this?
Yeah, well, as I said in the book, life in the Trump White House was like trying to work inside a pinball machine. And if you went in, as I did, having heard an awful lot about Donald Trump, I nonetheless believed that, like every other president, the weight of his responsibilities, the gravity of the issues he would have to deal with, would discipline him. And like every other president, he would address them responsibly. And in a sense, my book is a long story about how I was wrong on that.
Yeah, no, I think we could deal with a few more admissions of wrong in that way from others who've worked with him. Also regarding China, you kind of said this publicly at the time of the first impeachment, and it's in the book, that he had asked China for help with his re-election with 2020. Was there anything else about that you haven't said that you can say now?
Yeah, well, I didn't say in the book exactly what I wanted to say, because as part of the pre-publication review, this was intensely discussed, and I think it was an area where the then National Security Advisor and/or the White House Counsel's Office made it very hard to get as close as I wanted to get to what he actually said. And some people have said, since the book was published, well, I was in the room and that's not what Trump said. Let me just say, I agree, it wasn't what Trump said, because I couldn't put in exactly what he said. And until the day comes when I can get clearance for it, I'll just have to leave it with what's in the book, which is substantively correct, although they're not the exact words.
So are you saying that then that the review folks said that basically it's classified what Trump said in terms of seeking assistance from China for his re-election effort?
Yeah, and let me be clear, that was not the work of the NSC official who was actually doing the pre-publication review, and after 4 months concluded there was no classified information in the manuscript.
Right.
I think she was being pressured by her superiors because they knew exactly how sensitive that point was.
Well, that seems to be a big open question that the public deserves an answer to. Final question. There was a big to-do about whether you would testify or not testify in the first Trump impeachment, which was based on his muscling Zelensky and creating a quid pro quo, which in the book and elsewhere you've said was indeed true. You declined the invitation from the House Democrats to testify. You said you would in the Senate trial, but of course the Senate Republicans didn't want that. Do you have any regrets now, after all that's happened since then, about not having testified when the House Democrats asked you to do so the first time?
No, I don't have any regrets, because I think they bungled this whole thing. I think that the question to ask, it's a very complicated subject, but the question to ask was, did the effort to impeach Trump solely on Ukraine under the time schedule the Democrats were following, which is before their presidential primary season heat up, ultimately do what they said they wanted to do, which is, if they couldn't convict Trump, at least constrain and deter him? Or did the fact that he was acquitted ultimately embolden him? And I think it emboldened him. And I think that it may have been politically satisfying for the Democrats, but I think it simply said to Trump, I beat him, I can beat him again.
But if you had testified, the outcome might have been different.
I don't think so. And I think the Republicans had bought the White House argument that even if everything that Trump's accuser said was true, that what he did had not risen to the level of an impeachable offense. And that was, I think, something that they were prepared to accept. It's why they voted against passing a resolution in the Senate to have me come and testify.
Right. Well, of course, we can't do counterfactuals. So I said last question, one last question after that. And that is, looking at what's happening in Ukraine now, let's try to be optimistic for a second. What is your best, from your perspective, what is the best case scenario of how things can go from this point on?
Well, the absolute best case is that the Russians, whether it's Putin or somebody else, conclude that after even under 2 weeks, the performance of the Russian military has been so atrocious, and the resistance of the Ukraine military has been so phenomenal, that the best thing they can do is cut their losses and somehow figure out how to bring it to a stop. I think that's unlikely, but I think now the credibility and the reputation of the Russian military is damaged so badly that they've got to do something in their minds now to try and redeem their image. Otherwise, nobody will give them credence anywhere in their so-called near abroad. I'm afraid that what's going to happen is just a continuing grinding down of the people in Ukraine until at some point, maybe not for weeks or even months, people agree to bring it to a halt. I think we need to torque up the sanctions in a big way. I'd go after the Russian energy sector. If you don't apply the pressure now, I don't know what anybody's saving it for.
Well, thanks for giving me some time. You and I have had a lot of disagreements over the past decades, but it's good to have a strong substantive conversation about something that a lot of people care about at this point. So we'll be in touch.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it.